What if the simple kindness you showed someone thinking no one noticed was actually the most important test of your life? What if every small gesture, every moment of genuine care offered, without expectation of return, was being cataloged and measured by someone watching from the shadows? What if the person you thought had nothing to give was actually the one determining your entire future? These questions hung in the air of Carson's cafe on a Monday morning in March, though no one inside those walls knew it yet. Maddie Thompson was 34 years old, and she had learned to measure her life in increments of loss. 7 years ago, she'd owned a dream. It was a modest dream by most standards, a boutique bakery called Rise in the Cherry Creek neighborhood of Denver, where she'd invested 5 years of savings, her inheritance from her mother, and every ounce of courage she possessed. For 18 beautiful months it thrived. People lined up before dawn for her croissants. Wedding planners called her personally. Food bloggers featured her work. Then came the diagnosis that rewrote everything. Emma was 7 years old when the doctors said the words, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The panic was no longer a knot in Maddie's chest. It was a living, breathing monster that consumed her nights and colonized her mornings. The treatments were cutting-edge, experimental, and catastrophically expensive. Insurance companies sent letters with words like "not covered" and "investigational protocol," as though she needed reminding that her daughter's life came with a price tag society deemed too high to pay. The bakery was liquidated in 6 weeks. The house was mortgaged within 3 months. And Maddie took the first job that would allow her to be present during Emma's chemotherapy appointments. Server at Carson's Cafe on 5th and Madison, a place that smelled like burnt coffee and the ghosts of people who'd given up on something. Carson's Cafe wasn't designed for dreams. It was designed for pauses. The vinyl booths were the color of an old sunset, orange and faded, cracked in places where generations of elbows had rested. The jukebox still played country songs from 1987. The kitchen exhaled the permanent scent of grease and resignation. The clientele was the invisible army of Denver. Night shift nurses counting their hours. Retired postal workers nursing single cups of coffee like it was their last day on earth. Transient men who came in cold and left only slightly warmed. For 7 years, Maddie had become part of that furniture. She memorized orders that customers never asked her to remember. She learned that Harold, the retired accountant in booth 3, liked his eggs over medium with wheat toast, never rye. She knew that Linda, the night shift RN, took her coffee with exactly 1/8 inch of cream. No more, no less. She developed a supernatural ability to appear precisely when someone needed something, then vanish before guilt could settle into their gratitude. But it was the old man who changed everything. He arrived every Monday, without exception, at 7:47 a.m., not 7:45, not 7:50. The precision of it was ritualistic, almost ceremonial. He was perhaps 80 years old, though his face was a geography of wrinkles that suggested either decades of outdoor living or indoor worry, possibly both. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as though he'd recently been a larger man and simply forgotten to update his wardrobe. But the watch on his wrist told a different story entirely. It was a kind of timepiece that cost more than Maddie's monthly rent. A Patek Philippe she'd learned from an article she'd read while waiting in the hospital lobby during Emma's treatment cycles. He would sit in the corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the view of the street, and he would wait. Not for food, not for conversation. He would wait for Maddie, though she didn't know that yet. What everyone else at Carson's missed, Maddie noticed immediately. She noticed the tremor in his weathered hands, the way his fingers would shake slightly as he lifted the coffee cup. She noticed how his eyes tracked the kitchen staff with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with observation. She noticed the sadness that radiated from him like heat from cooling metal. She noticed he was profoundly, invisibly alone. So she began a ritual of her own. Every Monday morning, before his 7:47 a.m. arrival, Maddie would prepare his booth herself. She would wipe the table twice, once for cleanliness, once out of respect for the man who sat there. She would bring him black coffee in the ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle, the one she'd noticed he preferred over the standard cups she served to other customers. She would cut his wheat toast at precise diagonals, the way she'd observed him eating it weeks before. And then the moment that would define everything. She would sit across from him for exactly 3 minutes, not as a server, as a human being who noticed he existed. Week 1 passed in complete silence. He stared at his coffee as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking decades ago. His thin lips remained perpetually pursed in a state of preemptive disapproval. Maddie continued anyway. By week 2, she'd begun talking to fill the silence. She told him about Emma's latest blood work results. She mentioned the letter from the hospital's collection department. She described the foreclosure notice that had arrived the previous Thursday, how her hands had trembled when she opened it. The old man said nothing, but his eyes tracked every word, cataloging each confession, measuring each vulnerability. Month 1 arrived with a single gift, a nod, just a slight inclination of his head, barely perceptible. But Maddie saw it. She saw him. Month 2 brought something more tangible. When she sat with him one Monday morning, he met her eyes, really met them. And in that meeting, something shifted. The connection felt pure and simple, devoid of transaction or expectation. These 3 minutes every Monday morning became a strange anchor in her chaotic life, a moment where she was not a mother terrified her daughter would die, not a woman watching her house slip away, not a failure watching her dreams liquidate piece by piece. She was simply Maddie, someone who mattered to someone. By month 3, Marcus, the manager, had noticed her routine. He'd warned her repeatedly that she was wasting time on an old ghost who barely ordered anything. "You're leaving money on the table," he'd said, his eyes cold with the kind of pragmatism that came from never having loved anyone enough to risk everything. The other servers mocked her openly. "Look at Maddie playing nurse," they'd sneer as she prepared his booth. "Bet he loves the attention." Their laughter was the sound of people who'd never had to choose between kindness and survival. Maddie continued anyway. It was on a Monday in month 3 when the old man finally spoke beyond his initial greeting. Maddie sat across from him, mentioning that Emma's latest round of treatment was scheduled for Wednesday, and she was terrified the new protocol wouldn't work. The old man really looked at her, and said for words that would echo through the rest of her life, "Thank you, Maddie, for seeing me." She had no way of knowing that she was being observed, cataloged, and judged by the only person whose judgment would ever truly matter. Monday, 7:47 a.m., and the booth remained empty. Maddie stood at the counter, her eyes drifting toward the corner where she'd spent 18 months preparing for his arrival. The vinyl seat sat vacant, almost accusatory in its emptiness. She told herself it was nothing. People missed Mondays. They got sick. They took trips. There was 1,000 rational explanations for why the booth that had never been empty remained vacant. By 8:15 a.m., rationality had begun to crack. She'd checked the door 17 times. She'd wiped his table twice, then 3 times, then 4. She'd kept his ceramic mug at the ready, the black coffee warming in its usual position. Other customers came and went. Harold arrived at 8:12, Linda at 8:40. But the corner booth stayed dark, waiting for a man who didn't come. Maddie's chest had tightened into something that wasn't quite panic, but was definitely fear's cousin. By 9 a.m., she was afraid. A real, gripping fear that tasted like metal and felt like drowning. She'd known him for 18 months and barely at all. She didn't know his last name, didn't know where he lived, didn't know if he had family or friends or anyone who would check on him if he didn't show up for his coffee. The fear transformed itself into something worse. The knowledge that she genuinely cared about a man she could not help, could not reach, could not even properly worry about, because she had no way to do it. She was still staring at that empty booth when the glass doors of Carson's cafe swung open with deliberate force. 5 men entered. Tall men, the kind of tall that suggested expensive gyms and deliberate physical conditioning. They moved with military precision that was utterly alien to the humble disorder of Carson's. Their suits cost more than Maddie made in a month. The fabric hung on them with the weight of serious wealth. Their shoes were polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights like mirrors. The entire cafe fell silent. Even the coffee machine seemed to hush mid-gurgle. Harold's spoon froze mid-stir. Linda looked up from her eggs. Marcus emerged from the kitchen with the instinct of a man sensing danger he didn't understand. The 5 men walked directly to Maddie, not to Marcus, not to the counter. Directly to her, as though they'd known exactly where she'd be standing. The lead attorney was in his 50s, silver-haired, with a kind of face that had negotiated its way through decades of courtrooms and boardrooms. His suit was charcoal gray. His tie was silk. His eyes were the color of winter. "Are you Madeline and Thompson?" His voice was measured, formal, the kind of voice that delivered news no one wanted to hear. Maddie's hands had begun to shake. "Yes," she whispered. Emma is my daughter. Mr. Robert Caldwell passed away peacefully last night," the attorney said. The words landed like stones in still water. "His final will and testament contains provisions requiring your immediate presence." The coffee maker hissed. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. Maddie felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She hadn't even known his name. His name was Robert Caldwell. All these months, all these Mondays, all these moments of connection and vulnerability, and she'd never known his name. She'd called him sir in her mind. The other staff called him Ghost. And now he was gone, and she was grieving a man whose name she'd only just learned while he was being buried. The attorney continued, his tone never varying. "Mr. Caldwell was quite specific in his instructions regarding you. He documented the following. Every Monday, you cut his wheat toast into precise diagonal halves. You brought him black coffee in the ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle, never in the standard cups you served to other customers. You sat with him for exactly 3 minutes, not as a server fulfilling an obligation, but as someone who saw him as a human being worthy of attention. These details were not observed casually, Miss Thompson. They were observed deliberately. They were documented. They mattered." Maddie felt tears beginning to form, though she didn't fully understand why. Grief, yes, but something else too. The devastating realization that she'd been seen, not just by Robert, but by someone watching closely enough to notice that her kindness had been consistent, genuine, and offered without expectation of return. "We'll need you to come with us," the attorney said. A black Mercedes was waiting outside Carson's cafe. Its exterior gleamed with the polish of serious maintenance. Inside, the leather seats were soft in a way that suggested they'd never been subjected to the kind of wear that came from ordinary life. The interior smelled like expensive cologne and possibility. Maddie sat in the back seat still wearing her Carson's Cafe apron, her name tag pinned to her chest, watching Denver's streets pass through windows that seemed to separate her from everything she'd ever known. They drove downtown toward the glass towers that scraped the Colorado sky. The 42nd floor of the Caldwell and Associates building existed in a different atmosphere than the rest of Denver. Panoramic windows revealed the city stretched out below like a map of ordinary lives. From this height, people looked like dots. Problems looked manageable. Everything looked small. Maddie walked across marble floors that reflected the overhead lights like water. The walls were glass. Everything was glass and chrome in the kind of minimalist design that communicated one message. We have more money than you can imagine, and we've chosen to spend it on emptiness. Her reflection followed her across every surface. A woman in a Carson's Cafe apron, her blonde hair pulled into a hasty ponytail, her name tag catching the light. She felt like a stray cat in a palace. The conference room had a mahogany table that stretched what seemed like forever. Floor-to-ceiling windows, original artwork on the walls, the kind that required plaques explaining their significance. Maddie sat in one of the leather chairs, her hands folded in her lap, trying to make herself smaller than she already was. Gregory Caldwell entered first. He was 42, though his face held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been disappointed his entire life and had decided to become a professional at it. His designer suit was stretched tight over a frame that suggested he'd recently gained weight without acknowledging it. His scowl was permanent, etched into his features like a default setting. Behind him came Veronica Caldwell, his sister, equally dismissive, wearing the kind of jewelry that announced its cost before she spoke a single word. They'd been waiting, not waiting with patience, waiting with the restless fury of people who believed they were owed something by the universe and had finally arrived to collect. Gregory's eyes landed on Maddie, and his expression cycled through several emotions in quick succession. Confusion, contempt, incredulity. "This is who we've been waiting for." His voice carried the precise tone of someone tasting something rotten. "A waitress?" Uncle Robert's final wishes involve a coffee pourer from some Denver dive. Veronica laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "A waitress in a cafe apron." on the 42nd floor of our building. This is insane. The attorney, whose name was Richard Hayes, remained unmoved by their reaction. He'd clearly weathered worse. He gestured for everyone to sit, and the real theater began. Mr. Robert Caldwell's estate is valued at approximately $52 million, Richard began, his voice the same measured tone he'd used to deliver the news of death. It will be distributed according to the terms specified in his final will, which he updated just 3 months ago. Gregory leaned forward, his greed barely concealed beneath a veneer of filial concern. Okay, so what are we talking about here? A distribution timeline? Tax implications? Richard opened the will with deliberate slowness. To Gregory Michael Caldwell, in recognition of his role as family, I bequeath the sum of $2 million. The room erupted. Gregory's face flushed with a fury that transcended disappointment. $2 million? $2 million? That's it? Uncle Robert was worth $50 million, and I get 2. Additionally, Richard continued without pause, to Veronica and Caldwell, I bequeath the sum of $2 million. Veronica's response was slightly more controlled, but the anger beneath the surface was identical. They'd expected more, so much more. The universe had betrayed them. Richard turned a page with theatrical precision. To Madeline and Thompson, I bequeath the sum of $250,000. The silence that followed was profound. Gregory's eyes widened in disbelief. Veronica's mouth actually fell open. And Maddie felt the ground shift beneath her chair. $250,000 was enough to pay Emma's medical bills in full. It was enough to reclaim her house. It was enough to stop drowning. $250,000 to a coffee pourer? Gregory's laugh was bitter acidic. This is beyond comprehension. This is dementia. There's more, Richard interrupted, and his tone suggested he was actually enjoying this part. He continued reading. To Madeline and Thompson, I also leave the property located at 847 Riverside Drive in Denver, Colorado, registered under my private holdings. Gregory's expression cycled into something that resembled satisfaction. A property. Okay. A modest house, probably, something with sentimental value, but minimal monetary worth. Uncle Robert had been sentimental. This made sense. Money to the waitress, a house to make himself feel virtuous, and the real wealth to his actual family. Gregory actually smiled. A cruel smile, but a smile nonetheless. Included with said property, Richard read, his voice slowing slightly as though savoring the moment, is the complete investment portfolio and real estate holdings currently associated with that address, valued at approximately $8.7 million. The words seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the room. Gregory's smile froze on his face like a mask. Veronica's hand moved to her chest, as though her heart had just attempted escape. And Maddie felt the world reorganize itself. $8.7 million. Not in money, not in stocks or bonds or abstract wealth. $8.7 million in actual, tangible property and investments. Enough to change everything. Enough to build something. Enough to fulfill a promise she didn't yet understand she'd made. This is impossible, Gregory whispered. This is fraud. This, Richard said quietly, closing the will with finality, is exactly what Mr. Caldwell wanted. Maddie's hands had stopped shaking. She was still wearing her Carson's Cafe apron, still small, still out of place. But something had shifted. The palace no longer felt quite so foreign. It wasn't a cage, she would realize later. It was a kingdom. The key was old-fashioned, brass, the kind that existed in an era before electronic locks and security systems. Richard handed it to Maddie after Gregory and Veronica had stormed out of the conference room with their lawyers, already planning litigation they would never file. Mr. Caldwell's private study, Richard said. He hasn't allowed anyone in there for 15 years. Not his sister, not his advisors, not his household staff. He left specific instructions that you're to go there immediately. The study was on the 3rd floor of Robert's residence, a mansion in Cherry Hills that Maddie would later learn was worth $4 million on its own. She climbed the marble staircase, the key heavy in her hand, feeling like an archaeologist about to open a tomb. The door yielded to the key with a soft click. The room inside was not a study in the traditional sense. It was a war room. The corkboard covering one entire wall was dense with photographs newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and threads of red string connecting them like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. This wasn't random collection. This was military-level planning. Years of it. Decades of it. Maddie's eyes moved across the board, trying to parse the narrative embedded in chaos. There were photographs of buildings, newspaper articles about corporate mergers and hostile takeovers, banking documents, letters marked with dates spanning from 2003 to present day. In the center of it all was a photograph of Robert, not as an old man, but as a younger one, perhaps 45, standing beside a woman. She was beautiful. She had Robert's eyes, but warmer, infinitely warmer. She was smiling in the photograph, as though she'd just heard the world's greatest joke. The woman was labeled on the corkboard in Robert's handwriting. Catherine, my heart, my reason, my everything. Below the photographs was a section dedicated entirely to documentation, letters, emails, correspondence, all pertaining to a real estate development company called Meridian Development Group. And beneath that, a photograph of a man, handsome, expensive-looking, with the same smile that had destroyed everything. The backstory revealed itself piece by piece as Maddie moved around the room, her hands trembling. Catherine had created something called the Community Cafe Initiative in the 1990s. She'd built a network of affordable cafes across Denver and surrounding areas, places where working families could gather, where elderly people could escape loneliness, where anyone without means could find genuine hospitality. It was her life's work, her legacy, her reason for getting out of bed. Meridian Development Group had systematically destroyed it. The hostile takeovers were documented on the corkboard in meticulous detail. One by one, cafe by cafe, location by location. Meridian had purchased the underlying real estate, raised rents to unsustainable levels, and forced closures. Catherine had watched her life's work dissolve. She'd fought the company. She'd written letters to city officials. She'd exhausted herself trying to save what mattered most. She died of a stress-induced heart attack in 2004. Robert's response to her death had not been grief alone. It had been transformation. For 20 years, he'd quietly rebuilt his fortune with a single consuming purpose: to reclaim everything that had been stolen from Catherine's vision. He'd purchased Meridian Development Group in 2008. He'd systematically dismantled its predatory practices. He'd purchased back the original community cafe locations. And then he'd done something that the corkboard explained in Robert's own handwriting. Waiting. Always waiting. For someone like her. Someone like Catherine. Someone who sees the invisible people. Maddie found the photograph on a separate section of the corkboard. It was her, serving coffee at Carson's Cafe. The photo was candid, taken from a distance. In it, she was sitting across from Robert, and her face held something Robert had captured perfectly: genuine, unconditional regard. The kindness of someone who saw another human being and chose to make the matter. Beneath the photograph, in Robert's handwriting, was a note. She is Catherine's heart. She sees people others ignore. She offers kindness without expectation of return. She is worthy of carrying forward what we started. She is the reason this matters. Maddie felt something break open inside her chest. She hadn't been chosen for the coffee ritual. She'd been chosen because of who she was. Because in 18 months of genuine connection, she'd proven something essential. She was kind not for reward, but because kindness was who she was. She was Robert's final proof that virtue existed, that it could be observed in small gestures, in the cut of toast, in 3 minutes of undivided attention, that it mattered enough to be worth betting an entire fortune on. The mansion suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a responsibility, a shared understanding between a dead man and a living woman about what came next. The hospital's billing department had become an old enemy. They'd called Maddie so many times that she recognized the voice of Linda from collections, had even developed an odd sympathy for her, understanding that Linda was just delivering messages that crushed people as a job requirement. For 7 years, those calls had arrived with clockwork precision. 6 figures of medical debt, treatments, hospital stays, experimental protocols that insurance deemed too speculative to fund. 3 days after Robert's will had been read, Maddie walked into the hospital's administrative office and paid every bill in full. She wrote the check with hands that didn't feel like her own. The number on the paper, $287,000, should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt like oxygen finally reaching her lungs after years of drowning. The administrator's face cycled through multiple expressions: confusion, verification, then something that looked almost like compassion when she understood what was happening. "Your daughter's account is now fully cleared," the administrator said quietly. Maddie had driven directly home after that. Emma was at school. The house was empty. She'd sat down on the kitchen floor, actually sat, not stood, actually let her body give out, and she'd wept. But not from joy. The tears came from something deeper, more fundamental. They came from the release of pressure that had been building for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe normally. 7 years. 7 years of choosing between medications and groceries. 7 years of working double shifts, while Emma lay in hospital beds. 7 years of fear that manifested as a constant, grinding tension in her shoulders and jaw. 7 years of checking her account balance obsessively, doing mental math on medical bills, learning to pronounce words like experimental protocol and investigational drug. The weight was gone, not metaphorically. She felt physically lighter, as though gravity had released its grip on her spine. 2 weeks later, Maddie returned to Carson's Cafe. She arrived at 6:47 a.m., an hour before opening, and used the key that Richard had provided. The cafe was still dark, still smelling like the previous day's grease and coffee. Nothing had changed. The orange vinyl booths remained exactly as they'd always been. Harold's usual booth, Linda's counter seat, the corner booth where Robert had sat. Marcus arrived at 7:30 a.m., moving through his opening routine with a muscle memory of someone who'd been doing it for 15 years. He stopped dead when he saw Maddie sitting in his office. "Are you?" he started, then stopped, then started again. "What are you doing here? On a Thursday?" "I own this place," Maddie said quietly. "Robert Caldwell purchased Carson's 3 years ago. I inherited it." The word inherited hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's face moved through disbelief, then comprehension, then something that looked like resentment. When the other servers arrived, when they learned the news, the resentment became more pronounced. Resentment simmered beneath every interaction. They'd known Maddie. She'd been one of them, and now she was their boss, and the world had tilted. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, and the question carried subtext. "Are you going to fire us and bring in your own people? Upgrade to a fancier clientele?" Maddie had expected this question. She'd rehearsed the answer in her mind. "No one is getting fired," she said. "Carson's runs because of you, not because of me. I don't know how to manage a business this size. I need your help to do this right." It was the truth. She meant it, and something in her tone communicated that sincerity. The first real test came 2 weeks into Maddie's ownership. The commercial refrigerator failed. Complete failure. The compressor seized. The repair estimate was $8,000, and the refrigerator was old enough that repair might not hold. Marcus stood in the kitchen, looking at the dead machine with the expression of someone watching their livelihood collapse. "We can limp along for maybe a week," he said, "but if we can't cool anything, we're dead." Maddie approved the purchase of a new refrigerator, a commercial-grade unit top of the line, the kind that had seemed impossible just months ago. But she did something more important. She asked Marcus to choose it. She asked for his expertise. She asked for his opinion on the kitchen upgrades that followed. When the new refrigerator arrived, when the kitchen suddenly had equipment that didn't belong in a place like Carson's, the staff understood something. This wasn't about replacing them. This was about honoring what they'd built, then making it better. Maddie had taken their workplace and elevated it without erasing it. The corner booth remained exactly as it had always been, cracked vinyl and all. On the first Monday after Maddie took over, she found Harold sitting in his usual spot. He looked at her with new understanding. It was him, wasn't it? The old man. He was watching. "Yes," Maddie said, "and he left everything to you because he saw something in me," Maddie said. "The same thing I saw in him, the ability to notice people others ignore." Harold nodded slowly. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile Maddie had seen from him in 7 years. "I think I'm going to start ordering the fancy toast," he said. "The kind they cut diagonally." Maddie cut his toast in diagonal halves. She cut them with purpose, with intention. with the understanding that small gestures carry the weight of entire philosophies. Every diagonal cut was a promise that she would continue seeing people. Every Monday at 7:47 a.m., she would honor the ritual that had changed everything. The lawsuit arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning. 47 pages of legal documents designed by Gregory Caldwell's attorneys to accomplish a singular goal: to make Maddie's life impossible. The allegations were theatrical in their construction. Robert had been mentally incompetent, the documents claimed. He'd been susceptible to undue influence. A waitress had manipulated a vulnerable elderly man into transferring millions of dollars through calculated acts of false sympathy. The strategy was obvious. If they couldn't win on the merits, they'd win by making the fight so expensive that Maddie would surrender. Gregory hadn't just filed a lawsuit. He'd gone further. He'd called every media contact he had, feeding them a narrative of an elderly billionaire exploited by a gold-digger waitress. He'd threatened to investigate Carson's Cafe for health code violations. He'd begun a whisper campaign suggesting that Maddie was running the foundation into the ground, that donations were being mismanaged, that Robert's legacy was being destroyed. Richard Hayes, Robert's attorney, handled the legal defense with quiet precision. But he warned Maddie, "This will get messy before it gets resolved. He's going to try to destroy your reputation." The confrontation came 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. A public board meeting for the Caldwell Foundation, held at the downtown headquarters. Gregory had finagled his way onto the board through family connections and legal loopholes. He'd called an emergency meeting, ostensibly to discuss foundation governance concerns. Maddie arrived at 8:55 a.m. for a 9 a.m. meeting. She wore a charcoal suit that had belonged to one of Robert's pieces of art collection, a woman who donated it when she heard what Maddie was building. Her hair was professionally styled. Her posture was straight. She looked nothing like a waitress. She looked like someone who'd inherited a kingdom and was prepared to defend it. Gregory was already in the boardroom, holding court with 3 board members who'd arrived early. He smiled when he saw her, that cruel smile, the one that had greeted her with contempt in the law offices weeks before. "Come to surrender?" he asked loudly, ensuring everyone heard. "I respect that. It would have been ugly for you." Maddie sat at the table without responding. The room filled gradually. Board members, staff, observers. The media had gotten wind of the conflict. There were journalists in the back, cameras ready, waiting for scandal. The meeting was called to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Gregory wasted no time. He presented his allegations methodically. Mental incapacity, undue influence, mismanagement. He painted a picture of a predatory waitress who'd calculated her way into an elderly billionaire's through acts of false kindness. When he finished, the room was silent. Some board members looked uncertain. Doubt had been planted. Maddie stood. She didn't wait to be called upon. She simply stood and began speaking. "I want to tell you about Monday morning," she said, and her voice was steady in a way she didn't know she possessed. "For 18 months, I arrived at Carson's Cafe at 6 a.m. and I prepared booth. I cut wheat toast into diagonal halves. I brought black coffee in a ceramic mug with a chip on the handle. I sat with an elderly man for 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes, I talked about my daughter's illness. I talked about my medical debt. I talked about my foreclosure notice. The journalists were recording now. The cameras were capturing this. Mr. Caldwell never asked me for anything," Maddie continued. "He never promised me anything. I had no idea he was wealthy. I had no idea he was testing me. I was simply kind to someone who seemed invisible to everyone else. If that's manipulation, then I'm guilty, but I don't believe it is." She paused, and the room held its breath. "Mr. Caldwell wasn't testing for business acumen," she said. "He wasn't looking for someone to impress investors or maximize profits. He was testing for character. He was watching to see if kindness offered without expectation of reward actually existed. And he documented that test meticulously, not to hide it, but to prove it." Maddie pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of Robert's documentation. Every note, every photograph, every piece of evidence that his decision had been deliberate and documented. "The most telling evidence," she said, "isn't about me. It's about the other potential error. She opened the financial records. $3 million in business losses over the past decade. Investments that had failed spectacularly. A pattern of financial recklessness that Robert had documented in detail. And there in the file was a restraining order filed against Gregory Caldwell by a former business partner, alleging fraud. The room shifted. Cameras clicked. Journalists scribbled notes. Robert spent 20 years building fortune, Maddie said. Not to hoard it, to see how it should be distributed. And he determined that it should go to someone who understood that money isn't the point, that kindness is the point, that seeing people others ignore is the point. She looked directly at Gregory. He could have left everything to you. He chose not to. That tells you everything you need to know about what he believed you valued. Then she pivoted. I'm proposing something different than what Gregory wants. I'm proposing the Catherine Caldwell Memorial Foundation, a real expansion of Robert's legacy. 3 new community cafes across Denver. Scholarships for children with medical debt. A fund specifically designed to help people like I was, drowning in visible, desperate for one person to notice they existed. She pulled out the proposal. Professional, detailed, built not on ego, but on the work Robert had started, the work Catherine had begun. The oldest board member, Marcus Sterling, 87 years old, who'd known Robert for 40 years, stood up slowly. He began to applaud. One by one, other board members joined in. Not everyone, but enough. The room had shifted. The narrative had shifted. The applause grew until filled the entire conference room. Gregory sat frozen, watching his inheritance evaporate in real time, understanding finally that money alone was never going to be enough to win against the truth. Carson's Cafe looked like itself, but transformed. The orange vinyl booths remained, but they were complemented now by new tables of reclaimed wood. The walls displayed photographs, not corporate art, but images of people, regulars over the years, faces that had become part of the cafe's history. The corner booth had a bronze plaque, reserved in honor of Robert Caldwell, who understood that the greatest wealth is being truly seen by another human being. Marcus had become the general manager of not just Carson's, but the entire community cafe network. He'd proven his expertise over months of careful collaboration. The other servers, the ones who'd mocked Maddie for caring about an old man, now understood they worked for someone who valued them precisely because she'd seen them before she had power. 3 new community cafes had opened across Denver in the 6 months since the board meeting. Same model. Affordable meals. Welcoming spaces. Places where invisible people became visible. Maddie moved between all 4 locations, but Carson's remained her home. She arrived at 6 a.m. on Monday mornings, prepared the corner booth, and sat there for 3 minutes. Alone now, but somehow not. The ritual had transformed into something sacred. A weekly conversation with Robert's memory. A promise to continue seeing. Emma was in remission. Completely, definitively in remission. Her hair had grown back. She was in 6th grade now, talking about what she wanted to study in college. The medical debt had been paid. The house had been saved. The foreclosure notice had become ancient history. But Maddie had learned something that Robert had known all along. Money wasn't the victory. The victory was finding balance. Finding a way to live between the old life and the new. Between the kindness that had defined her as a server and the power that came from ownership. Between her daughter's needs and her vision for something larger than herself. The foundation was growing. 12 community cafes now. A scholarship program that had helped 43 young people attend college. A medical debt assistance program that had eliminated nearly $8 million in health-related debt for working families. And Maddie had discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. At building. At seeing potential in people others overlooked. At taking Robert's vision and expanding it in ways that honored its origin. One Monday morning, a young woman came into Carson's Cafe. She was maybe 22, wearing work clothes, exhausted in the way that came from double shifts and financial desperation. She ordered black coffee and wheat toast. She sat in a back corner booth, and she looked invisible. Maddie brought her the coffee and the toast, cut into diagonal halves. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Maddie asked. The young woman looked startled. No one asked to sit with invisible people. "Sure," she said quietly. Maddie sat across from her. "I'm Maddie," she said. "What's your name?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just, no one usually talks to me." Maddie reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I notice you," she said. "I see you." And in that moment, the ritual continued. The circle widened. The test went on. The grace of one person noticing another, truly noticing, rippled forward into the future. The greatest investments we make aren't in stocks or properties. They're not in buildings or portfolios or financial instruments. They're in each other. A simple act of kindness, offered without expectation of return to someone who seems to have nothing, can ripple outward in ways we can never predict. It can change a life. It can transform a future. It can prove that virtue exists, that it matters, that it's worthy of being observed and honored and passed forward. Who are the silent observers in your life? Do you have the grace to notice them? Are you brave enough to offer kindness without reward, not knowing if anyone is watching? Because someone might be. Someone is always watching, and they're deciding whether to trust humanity based on whether you see them when no one else does. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible people around you, hit that like button. Your support tells me you believe in these stories. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Maddie's position? How would you have responded when you learned you were being tested? Subscribe now, because the next story might be about you. The next moment of kindness might transform your entire existence. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their small gestures matter. They always matter. They're always being noticed. Always.